Hi there, and welcome to today's Fresh Start conversation. Today we are talking about this one thing that is common to all humanity. It's called grief. There's a quote that says, grief is a club that does not need you to send a request to join. You join automatically. At one point or the other, you will be joining this club, either by loss of a loved one, loss of a job, loss of something that is very significant in your life. And this can be very devastating. What do you do when you're going through grief? And what about kids and grief? How do we support our children when we have lost a loved one in the family? All this is in our conversation today. So join me with a grief therapist that is going to take us through this conversation. And before I go, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, kindly do. And don't forget to press on the bell notification button so that you're notified anytime we send in new videos. Hi there, and welcome to Fresh Start Conversations. Today, the conversation is around grief, something that at one point or the other, you may go through. And that is why this conversation is so important. And to help us through this conversation, I brought in a grief therapist. We are going to allow her to introduce herself as she takes us through this conversation. Welcome, my dear.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's good to be here.
Good to see you, and thank you for saying yes to the calling that I gave you. I think grief is an important conversation. Kindly just introduce yourself so that we know what you do and your names.
Okay. My name is Mueni.
Yeah.
I have served as a pastor at the Nairobi Baptist Church.
Okay.
I'm a grief therapist, an authenticity coach, and a pastor.
Yeah.
What does that all mean?
Yeah.
It means that I help people manage transitions in a manner that, one, is true to who they are, honors God, and protects their dignity.
Wow.
Because we all get into grief in one point or the other, and every time we look at grief, we only think about grief in the sense of loss, death of a loved one.
Yeah.
But did you know that there are up to about 42 things that impact the human heart at the level of a loved one? And each one of those 42 things sets us off into a transition journey. Now, whether we willingly got into that journey or we were thrust into it, we must be able to adjust into the new space we find ourselves or we'll drown.
Yeah. Very important indeed.
Yeah.
Now, what would you say grief is?
Grief is essentially defined as the conflicting feelings that arise out of change of life as we have known it.
Yeah.
That's the basic definition of grief. Like I said, there are 42 things.
Yes.
And these 42 things, when I was studying about grief, it was interesting to learn the diversity of those 42 things.
Yeah.
Many of them, yes, you could see how that can become grief from, of course, death of a loved one, changing of jobs, transferring children from one school to another leaves our children in a path of grief.
Yeah.
Moving from one estate to another puts our children in a state of grief because that's what they have known, that's what has been familiar. Moving from one state of life into another, for instance, if you get thrust into it and you have an accident, God forbid, but if I was on my way here and then I have an accident and now maybe I lose a limb, I have to relearn how to function as Mueni without a limb. That puts me in a state of grief because I'll be remembering the good old days when I had two limbs, two hands.
Yeah.
So grief is always about the change. And because life is constantly changing, we are constantly grieving what we have known.
Yeah.
One of the, For instance, in the year 2020, many of us will fondly remember the good old days pre-COVID.
Yeah. So we are actually in grief.
We are in grief, and the sad thing is many of us are not able to recognize that actually is grief. It's a form of grief.
Yeah.
We are grieving lives as we knew them. We are grieving the freedom that we had. We are grieving the choice that we had. And so we miss that. And so we find ourselves out of sorts. But that out of sorts is actually an emotional adjustment and in an emotional response to the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. It's interesting that we actually think grief of only 2 things or 3 things. And when you actually mention them, it brings to the realization that grief is all around us.
One of the funniest one, funny, not funny, haha, but funny, strange. And I mean, one of the funniest ones I discovered when I was studying was that, you know how we have parents, mothers particularly, and I know this because I've had this conversation with many mothers, and because I hear this a lot, because I'm in that age where you have mothers say, I am going to get a younger child, you know, to be the remote control, to be the one to send around.
Wakutoa vitu kwa
Wakutumatuma, handbag.
Yes.
So you find there's a child who's 18. And then the mother goes and has a child.
Generation gap.
Yes. So those 2 children, unfortunately, are actually set up to grieve their lives, because these 2 may never be able to comfortably relate with one another as siblings.
Yeah.
So this younger one will always look at this 18-year-older one as deputy mom or deputy dad, you know, and this older one will constantly be wondering, who are you? You know, because and then sometimes even the moms themselves, unless it was an intentional choice to have that child, sometimes the moms themselves feel, oh gosh, I should be embarrassed. Why am I having a child at this age when the other one? So it actually can set off it can disrupt the structure that the family had. And as a therapist, I've actually seen husbands come and say, can you imagine my wife got pregnant? And now we have a little child. And so he's completely angry with her for having conceived and thinking, our life had found a rhythm. Now we are going back to diapers, and we are still dealing with university fees. Because normal life is expected to be predictable, deliberate, and methodological. So we tend to think that there's a certain flow, there's a certain rhythm. Now, when that rhythm or flow gets disrupted, the human reaction is to grieve from the former life.
Wow. Interesting to learn that there's so many types of griefs that we go through in our day-to-day. Some are manageable, and maybe some are subtle. That is why we don't recognize them,
Yes. Some many
they're subtle. And manageable. So they don't disrupt our lives that much. But some are major.
Many are subtle. We don't notice them. But also more important, just as important, is that the people around us don't notice them. So I may be grieving, but because the people around me don't notice it, and I may therefore not get the support that I need, I quickly decide my grieving is not as important, or my grief is not real, or my grief is my mind playing imaginations on me. So I will dismiss it, even though there's a nagging feeling inside of me that something is not right, then I will not deal with it. But the other reality is part of the reason why people don't deal with it is because we actually don't know how to deal with it. So,
and that's why you're here.
We ignore it. It's uncomfortable.
It is.
It brings to the fore our own inability and our own lack of capacity. So we are better off just leaving it unspoken and hoping that by ignoring it, it will go away by itself.
But it doesn't.
No,
it doesn't.
So
grieving is actually very important.
Yes, it is.
Nobody talks to us about it. Nobody teaches us how to do it. And even the people who tell us, go and grieve, don't tell us what to do. What does that look like? Yeah. What does that look like?
True.
So what does that look like?
First of all, the foundation of being able to grieve healthily is to actually acknowledge that something has happened.
Okay.
And that is a place of self-awareness.
Yeah.
So if I am in a relationship and that relationship comes to an end, as the place to begin with is to acknowledge Anthony was my friend, and now we are no longer friends. I am going to grieve the friendship we have had over the years. Anthony and John used to go shopping. Well, men don't go shopping. Used to go for nyama together, you know. And so the shop that they used to go for nyama has now burnt down. So they now have to find a new rhythm of how to bond, because they bonded over nyama.
Yeah.
And so they need to process, okay, now we have nothing in common. Maybe the only reason Anthony and John were friends was because they worked in the same organization. When Anthony or John leaves that organization, do they still have something in common? Do they still have a friendship? Sometimes you may find they may continue trying to insist on having that friendship because it is familiar, and not because it is a friendship.
Yeah.
Simply because it was the known thing, it was the done thing, it was the routine, because human beings have the capacity to get used to the familiar.
Yes.
Then to desire the predictable.
Yeah.
So now that even though the predictable has been shaken, they want to hold on to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how about death? Where do we start? Because death, there's a quote I read somewhere that death can be violent. You know, the helplessness and how no control I have over it, yet it is a must. For people who have gone through death, how do they begin? What does that grief look like?
The difference between death and the other types of grief that people go through is no one has been on the other side and come and told us what it looks like. You know, so at least with the other griefs, whether it is getting married, because that can also grieve you, or getting separated, or getting divorced, or transferring from one neighborhood to another, or moving from one country to another, which are all realities of life that can leave you in grief. We also are able to look and say, so-and-so moved, so-and-so's life changed. So I can look at them and I can see either a message of hope or even a coping mechanism, and look at how did they manage. So because people get to the other side and you're able to relate to how the other side looks like, then that makes it manageable, or at least you have a starting point on how to process it, because you can see what it will look like when you get to the other side. Yeah. Now with death, unfortunately, depending on there are things that will complicate grief when it comes to death, and there are factors that will complicate it. For instance, how did the person die? When did the person die? What was the relationship with the person before they died? What was even the last conversation? Those are all things that become factors when we are grieving the person. For instance, if your loved one left, and the last conversation with them was a disagreement, and you mkambiana kwenda huko sitaki kukuona tena, and then they pass away, or you die, you know, you're left, then that person, the one who is left alive, is left with a sense of guilt, a sense of shame, a sense of regret, a sense of could have, should have, would have. But and that makes it very difficult, because even if they want to apologize, there's nothing they can do about it, because that person is no longer alive. So it becomes one of those complicated ones where you have to forgive or seek forgiveness from someone who's not alive.
How do they go about it?
They're different.
Especially the difficult one, when I have a sense of guilt, a sense of regret. Where do I start? Okay.
One of the things about grief is that, and this happens to me a lot when I see clients in my therapy room. Someone will come to you because I lost my mom.
Yes.
I lost my dad. But the thing about grief is that when you go to, when you find someone at that place, the grief, the incident that happened, the event that brought that person to the therapy room, is not the only issue, and therefore while it may be the main issue that brought them to the therapy room, it's no longer the main issue, because it is not the only issue on the table. So you may find, while I'm dealing with the loss of my mom, I'm dealing with how she never approved of my lifestyle. I'm dealing with how I never told her that I loved her.
So the things that make us guilty.
Yes. I never told her that I did not like this about her. So it's unprocessed and unspoken conversations may be the ones that actually weigh more on the person. So what you do in therapy, you begin to help the person to manage those unresolved or unprocessed emotions.
So one of the things that we may need to do is actually look into ourselves and see if we have unresolved emotions, especially with, let's say, death with this person, and we may need to address that first as you journey towards healing or getting better in grief. But what does even healing look like? Because I've had experiences where people are waiting for healing, and they'll come and ask me, Jackie, I lost my mom, I lost my husband 20 years ago, not 25 years ago, but I'm not getting better. So the people who expect getting better is that they will go back to be the people they were before they lost this person. So every time they feel they have not gone back to that person, they think we have not healed. What does healing look like?
One thing we must acknowledge is that grief changes us.
Yes.
So we can never go back to, it's like a breaking of an egg. It doesn't matter what you do, you can't unbreak it. You can't go back, and it doesn't matter. It's broken, and that has changed. Now, grief is also the same way. Grief changes us. Now, there are things that are undone or done, happen in such a manner that they can never go back. You see, even if I say I had my limb cut, you know, back to that example, I had my limb cut. I would go to doctors, and they would probably give me a new hand, you know, a new hand, and a prosthetic. And now the surgery is really amazing nowadays. The medical world is really amazing. So they will give me one that looks completely like my hand. I'll even be able to put my ring on it, and unless you really look closely, you'll not realize that hand is not Mueni's hand. But guess what? As long as I know that this hand is not my hand, I will always be feeling like this hand looks odd. This hand is not in place, because it's not so much about what people around me are seeing. It's about what I am seeing. So even when I get a new hand, I get a prosthetic, I have to go to understand how to manage with it. You know, I have to be taught how to manage to live with this new hand. Now, if I have rejected that I lost a hand,
a limb,
and I have a new one,
I
will find myself taking the pile of clothes to the washroom. I wash clothes, but I forgetting that my new hand does not allow me that.
Function,
So it's not so much about what other people see, it's also what I believe about what I have lost. So it really is a lot to do with the emotional journey of grief. Now, essentially, one of the leading people who have studied grief is a lady called Professor Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She gave a framework of what the grief stages look like. So we have denial, we have anger, we have bargaining, depression, and acceptance. New scholars have put in new normal after acceptance and talked about a sixth stage. Others even have a seventh stage, you know, where we find re-emergence of a new self. And while these stages are good, they are not descriptive. They are not you don't have to go through them, but they give us a framework to work with. They give us a framework to be able to even self-assess, or even when you're speaking to a therapist, there are things you can talk to a therapist about what you're feeling, and your therapist is able to tell, this is what you're struggling with. Now, there are many other emotions that grief brings to the fore. For instance, if you're in your 20s and your friend dies in a road accident. Now, as a 20-year-old person in campus, you're thinking, wait a minute, it is only old people who die. 20-year-olds are not supposed to get cancer and die. 20-year-olds are not supposed to die in road accidents. So it brings to the fore your own mortality.
Yes.
So you'll find that that 20-year-old is now dealing with, am I ready to die? Can I die? Is life dangerous? But you see, the leading cause of death is life.
Yes.
So every day we are alive, we are candidates for death. So how do we live? Essentially, you would want people to be equipped, to be aware that we need to be able to live our lives with the awareness that because you're living, it means you're a candidate for death.
Yeah.
It means that even your loved ones are candidates for death. Now, that's not to mean that we live in fear. It means to live in awareness.
Yes. Awesome. What I'm getting from you is that in death, if anyone watching this and they've experienced death of a loved one, that yes, we have stages of grief that have been put there, and then you might go to Google and just look at it, and that is the stages of life. The stages of grief will come, it will be the first things that you see. But these stages still come with other many emotions that may need to be dealt with. My question is, if I have experienced death and I'm aware that these stages of emotions are there, and I can see maybe I'm experiencing some, I don't think maybe they come in the same order, some might come in different orders because we are different. How do I know that I can handle this? I don't need therapy. And what are the signals that if I am at that stage, I should get support, I should let somebody walk with me?
One of the things that we need, again, self-awareness is key.
Yes.
So when you are self-aware, when you know that normally grief affects us in different fronts of our being. So if you're self-aware, you would be able to say when Mueni is on a good day, on a normal place, Mueni eats half a chapati.
Yes.
Okay. But now when he is grieving, when he's eating 3 chapatis, something is amiss. This is emotional eating and not Mueni as we have known her. Okay. On a normal day, Mueni sleeps for 2 hours. Now she's sleeping for 5 hours or she's not sleeping at all. What's going on? So when you're self-aware about who you are on a good day, then when something changes, you can begin to, you can be able to tell. That's one. 2, the people around you. So I can be thinking, but I'm eating. I'm just eating. I'm just eating more chapatis. The chapatis were just tastier. And I'm thinking to dismiss it. But you begin to see, it's not just the chapatis. There's something. And you begin, and sometimes it doesn't come alone with just food. It could be, I am more withdrawn from people. I have shut people out. I am more cut. I am angry.
Yes.
And when we go through some of the losses that we go through, when we go through some of the transitions we go through, some of them can be very violent and therefore public and known. So if, God forbid, but if I was to lose my husband today, the people around me would know. So the people around me, even though they are not therapists, they would know that you're going to be set off on a grieving angle because you've lost your husband, because people who lose their husbands grieve. Okay. And so that would, even when I'm not aware of it, the people who are supporting me may say something that may make me begin to think, there could be something about what they said. There are other griefs that we go through that are a bit silent. And nobody even supports you. Think about when a marriage comes to an end. Nobody comes to visit you because you know your husband moved out. Nobody visits you. In fact, sometimes you're like, okay, it's a good thing her husband moved out. Sometimes, and so you're grieving, but you're by yourself. So it's very lonely. And sometimes not only are you by yourself, you're dealing with the judgment of the people around you. So how do you manage that alone? When you're by yourself, that's when you have the conflicting emotions. You have the, I am relieved he's gone, but I am feeling a sense of rejection. I am feeling so it's a question of being able to interrogate your emotions and think, is there a Mueni before? Is there a Mueni after? Is there a change? This is a major thing that has happened.
To
some
you.
things that happened to us are watershed.
Yeah.
You know, there's an advert that used to come a few years back on for Safaricom, you know, and there's this woman in the market, she's shopping, and then she gets a call, and then kwachua, you know, and she jumps and throws everything. Now, it's important to realize that grief is not only when negative or bad things happen to our lives. Even that woman who kwachuas and now has 10 million shillings from having 10,000 at most, or even 5,000 or 500. Now she has 10 million shillings. She's going to grieve.
Yes.
She's going to undergo a transition. Her life is going to be expected to undergo a transition. They're going to be, I mean, you can no longer go to the place you used to live in, maybe. So there's going to be a transition that has come as a result of what has changed in her life. Now, for this woman, there's going to be a question of what was life before.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a clear, this day, nilikwachua. So there's always, sometimes you find there's a clear distinction.
Between the life before and
life
after.
Now.
Yeah.
And that distinction is what now changes us, because grief changes us.
And I think it also will help you to evaluate if you need support, so that you're not sinking deeper.
Yes.
Yes.
Now
I can get support in my grief.
Yes.
It's becoming
normal grief is actually not considered a disease.
Yes.
It's really not a disease.
Yeah.
But there should be a natural progression from the intensity of the emotions of the day. Think about the loss of a loved one. When you immediately get the news of the loss of a loved one, people faint, people collapse, people, you know, there's all that intensity of emotion from the news. Think about funerals and the intensity of emotions at funerals. Now, if 3 months down the line, when you tell someone about the loss of their father, and immediately they hear about that, they collapse, they faint, just as they did on the first day, then it's clear that this grief is not progressing normally.
Yeah.
The intensity of the emotion should not only decrease, but it should actually change.
Yes.
That's not to say you're not still heavily grieving. It's that now you should be in a different stage of your grief.
Yeah.
You may still be questioning, you may still be crying, you may still be angry,
but
you may still be bargaining, but it's different.
Yeah.
Something is changing.
Yeah.
You're still, by that time, even if you're employed, you should be able to go back to work. You may not be as productive as before, but at least you're able to wake up and go to work. Unlike the first day when you can't even function.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there should be a normal transition.
Yes.
The minute you're not able to live your life and carry on with the activities, the daily activities of your life, then that begins to be a pointer that you're struggling with that grief, and
you
it's
need
not
support.
progressing as it should have. Yes, and you need support.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about adults most of the time, about especially this process that we're talking about. How do we support children, especially when there's grief in the family of death? Yeah.
The first thing to support children is, first of all, to involve them in the conversation.
Okay.
I speak to adults today who we find that their struggle is a grief that happened when they were children that was not supported.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you find they say, I came home from school, I found people in the house, and then nobody said anything to me. And then on one Saturday morning, I was made to wear new clothes and told, Beba msalaba, or carry the photograph, and baba yako ndio kwa sanduku. And so they just never could comprehend what happened, what changed, why didn't they tell me? And then we come back and then we have to move houses.
So and no conversation about it.
No conversation about it.
Yeah.
And even when people come to visit a family that is bereaved, we concentrate on the wife.
Adults.
We concentrate on the adults. The children are locked up in a room or told, and then inje mcheze, or sometimes they even shipped to another relative's place, a neighbor's place, so that their life is not disrupted. And yet their life has been disrupted. So we need to have age-appropriate conversations with children when a change happens. And that, when we come back to the griefs I told you about, the changing of schools, they're moving from one neighborhood to another. You need to involve the children in that journey. So if you're moving to neighborhood X, take them to neighborhood X. Let them begin to see this is how the news. Give them a familiarization tour of it. Okay. Let them take them back to their old school. Let them say farewell to their friends, or give them notice. Sometimes as parents we tend to think, I am taking you to another school, bigger, better, brighter, therefore you should enjoy it. But it's not the same. Okay. You need to help them emotionally to make the transition, that journey. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome insights. And I think I've also learned a lot about grief from just these conversations. There may be somebody who needs support today because they're grieving or going through something. How can they reach you?
Okay. Yeah. They can reach on Facebook.
Yeah.
Mueni Wambua. Yeah. On Twitter, Mueni Wambua.
Okay.
On LinkedIn, Mueni Wambua.
Okay.
Or on Instagram, Miss Authenticity.
Miss Authenticity.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for coming, and thank you for having this conversation with us. I'm sure that you've picked a lesson or two from today's conversation. You may be going through grief of in whatever area that you have experienced it. If you have, I hope today's talk will support you in your journey. Kindly remember to subscribe and also pressing on the bell notification button so that you're notified anytime we send in good new videos. See you in the next video.